Hey everybody, it's Rapid. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our little series by looking at the worst rank 4 vehicle in all of War Thunder. And as a little reminder, we are going to be looking at the win rate on statshark.net. Additionally, we are not going to be having any anti-airs, and we are only going to be looking at mainline tech tree vehicles. If you want to know why, I talked about that in the first video in this series. And the winner for today with the worst overall win rate at rank 4 is the M109G, specifically the German variant at a 40.4% win rate, which is pretty terrible. It has a total of 0.64 kills per spawn and 0.74 kills per death. Now, while some of you may be surprised by that, I definitely wasn't, because it turns out I actually did a much older video on the entire M109 family, except for the one that wasn't released at the time, the Rochev, and that video absolutely skyrocketed in views. It is currently one of the most viewed videos on this entire channel. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that just means that people are having some trouble with the M109s. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the G variant. Here are the top search terms that led people to this channel. You can see M109 in general is up here a lot, but also M109G specifically is up here a lot. So a lot of people came to this specific channel looking for tips on this specific vehicle. So I guess we're doing another installment and trying to go a little bit more in depth. Of course, this neatly leads into the question, there are several M109s, how in general are they all doing? Well, obviously the M109G is doing the worst. The second worst is Italy with their M109G as well, but that has a 47.9% win rate, 0.90 kills per spawn, and 1.09 kills per death. So the Italian M109G is doing noticeably better by every attribute. That being said, both the American and Israeli M109Gs are definitely doing better than the German one, but not by that much, at least in terms of kills per spawn and kills per death, although they are doing much better in terms of win rate. So ultimately, while the German mains are definitely struggling with their particular M109, the M109 in general is also struggling to put up a positive win rate across the board, and only the Italian one goes positive in terms of KD, with the British one being basically even. Now, since I have an entire video and a fairly lengthy one going over a lot of the different characteristics of the M109 family, I'm going to truncate this a little bit more and focus a little bit more on the mechanics and the specific challenges faced by German teams. That being said, we will start off with a look at the mobility. The overall weight is 24.5 tons with 405 horsepower, which is a pretty decent power to weight ratio, although not exactly great. For World War II standards though, it's not bad, and the forward speed of 56 kph is actually pretty decent. The reverse speed of 12 kph is pretty acceptable. Overall, while I'd say the mobility of the M109 isn't really its strong suit, if you were to compare it to a standard medium tank of its battle rating, you wouldn't really notice it being any worse. In fact, in many cases, it would actually be slightly better. The armor on the M109 is pretty awful. In general, while it will protect you from rifle caliber machine guns across most arcs, it is not really that useful against basically anything else. Even 50 cals can absolutely tear you to pieces, which is a fundamental problem with this vehicle as it is the German version, and the German version fights USA and Russia that tend to have more roof-mounted heavy machine guns than anyone else. The only areas really counting in the M109G's favor in terms of overall durability is that the M109G does generally have thin enough armor that it doesn't properly fuse armor-piercing high explosive shells, and you do have a decent number of crew and a fairly decent sized interior, so on the whole, if an APHE shell doesn't fuse correctly, the odds of it killing you in a single hit are not the best. So you can sometimes survive hits, although surviving hits in a condition to return fire is uncommon but not completely unheard of. Of course, the roof of the vehicle is paper thin. It's not technically open topped, but it is still very easy to overpressure from things like rockets and bombs, and on top of that, even basic 50 cals can shred you from top down, and even rifle caliber machine guns can put some damage in, so planes in general are going to be a bit of a nuisance around this battle rating. Of course, going into firepower, and this is where we get to one of, in my opinion, is actually the biggest drawback of the M109G, and that is the M109G only has an MG3 machine gun. It doesn't have a 50 cal like all the other M109s. Indeed, the last vehicle we talked about in the series, the M44, all of those have 50 caliber machine guns. The 50 cal is kind of important for fending off aircraft, but more importantly, if an M109 runs into another M109, the M109 with the 50 cal has an intrinsic advantage because both of them can be penned by 50 cals. So if you run into another M109, it doesn't even have to fire its main gun at you to kill you, but you do have to fire your main gun to kill it. Of course, one thing that you will find very familiar with the M109 is your initial stock shell and your smoke shell, because they are the exact same shell as the one you just had on the M44. However, because the M109 does have a longer barrel, they do have a higher velocity. The high explosive shell technically has better penetration, but only kinetic pen. It doesn't affect overpressure, so it doesn't really matter that much. But generally speaking, the higher velocity does mean the rounds are a little easier to aim, but overall doesn't really influence how you play the vehicle. We do, however, add a brand new shell to the mix, and this is a proximity fuse shell. A proximity fuse shell will detonate if it gets close enough to the ground or close enough to an object, which can be a ground vehicle, but it can also be a plane. So in certain scenarios, you can use this as an anti-aircraft shell. With that being said, this is where we get to one of the more awkward aspects of the M109, and that is the turret traverse. The turret traverse, even on an ace crew, is only 11 degrees per second, which is quite slow even for a World War II era vehicle. On top of that, your reload is not exactly impressive as well. It's only 13.3 seconds on an ace crew, 17.3 seconds stock, so it's a little faster than the M44, but honestly not so much that you notice. Basically, all of the tactics that you're probably used to with the M44 will have to be applied to the M109 because it's exactly as inflexible if you miss a shot. So at this point in the series, you could say we're starting to see a pattern. The last three vehicles have all been German tank destroyers that have comparatively long reloads for their battle rating and basically no armor. These types of vehicles are not exactly conducive to a playstyle where you simply press W and then click on the red name tags when you see them, because these types of vehicles are somewhat inflexible and it's very easy to get caught out if you're not planning ahead. Indeed, this is one of the biggest weaknesses of less experienced players, is you usually want to have at least some idea of where you want to go before you start going there, and these types of vehicles will severely punish not doing that. Of course, the obvious question is, do I think the M109 deserves to be this low? And the answer is, probably not. We can tell the German one is struggling more than the other two, and of course this could be down to a variety of factors. Number one, German teams around this battle rating tend to be less experienced. Another big factor, as I mentioned, is the lack of a 50 cal to fight off the other M109s, because a lot of common opponents have their own. One small factor that does work in your favor, however, is that the strongest casts around this battle rating are actually all German, so you don't have to worry about things like Focke-Wulf 190s or DO335s or ME262 strafing your turret, and often the enemy air, in my experience, will be a lot more busy dealing with your air than they will taking you out. That's not to say you won't get focused, but it is less common than it was when I was playing things like the American M109. That being said, there are several Soviet vehicles around this battle rating that are actually reasonably annoying for artillery pieces like this to take out, and that's what we're about to discuss when I go into the tips and tricks. So a lot of things that I mentioned about the M44 would equally apply to the M109, as you're using a very similar gun with a similarly awkward reload. You generally want to have a good idea of where you want to go, and you need some kind of hard cover that you can stick to between reloading. Your team can also effectively be an early warning system for the enemy, because if you keep them around you, at the bare minimum, they're probably going to die first, and that will give you some indication that enemies are nearby. Additionally, some overhead cover can definitely help you out from getting strafed by planes, although as I mentioned, it's less prevalent with the German variant specifically than it is with some of the other ones, just because of how dominant German CAS is at around this battle rating. Additionally, German anti-air around this BR tends to be quite good as well, with both the Zerstörer and the Kugelblitz. Of course, one of the biggest challenges with these kind of artillery vehicles is the overpressure mechanic. Now, with the M44, you didn't need to know that much about the overpressure mechanic in order to get it to work, because the M44 was actually somewhat overclocked for its battle rating in terms of firepower. The M109, not quite as much, so we do have to briefly talk about how overpressure works so that you understand why you're shooting where you're shooting. So in this example, we have the good old Panther. This is a common vehicle, and if you're a German main, you've probably noticed that enemy artillery pieces can kill the Panther very easily. There is one fairly significant reason for that, and that is how overpressure works. When an overpressure round hits a point on an enemy, it will check in a radius around where it impacted to see if it can find an armor plate that is thin enough for it to penetrate. Notice when I'm talking penetration for overpressure, I'm talking the fragmentation pen and not the actual kinetic pen. So if the round finds a plate that is thin enough for it to penetrate, it will effectively treat all of the armor as transparent, and combined with the very high amount of damage that these kind of high explosive shells do, this will often result in a one-shot kill for the vehicle. So in the case of the Panther, if a shell hits the mantlet directly, while it can't pen the mantlet and it can't pen a lot of areas around the mantlet, it can pen the whole roof. So when the shell looks down to see if it can penetrate anything, it will see that thin plate, discover that it can pen, and it will treat all of the armor as transparent. This is also where it's interesting to look at another aspect of overpressure, because it does occasionally come up. While overpressure treats the armor and external components as transparent, it doesn't treat the entire vehicle as transparent. Internal components like an engine or transmission can still eat shrapnel. Now, generally speaking, these high explosive rounds have enough fragmentation that it doesn't really matter in most cases, but this can occasionally mean that if you overpressure somebody but your round is too far back on the vehicle, it might all just get eaten up by the engine. That being said, now it's time to look at a common American vehicle, the American Jumbo, and you'll see quite a few of these around these battle ratings, and a lot of other American vehicles have similar layouts. Much like the Panther, if you hit the turret face on the Jumbo, certainly the round is not going through that by any means. However, as soon as the round looks down, it will see the driver's hatch and realize that it can pen the Jumbo. This is why a direct hit to the turret face of the Jumbo will often do the trick. However, the side of a Jumbo turret is fairly thick, so if the round hits the side and there is nothing else thin for it to see, the round won't pen. So ironically, the side of the Jumbo is actually a slightly bigger challenge than the front of the Jumbo. This is also where it's worth noting one of the critical aspects of basically every American tank around this battle rating, and that is, even though you can overpressure it, all of them have 50 cals, and it only takes 1 or 2 bullets to the side of the turret to completely knock out your gunner, and then you're basically dead in the water. So even if these American tanks are on reload, you need to make sure that they are not looking at you before you go out for a shot, or at the very least that they can't swing their 50 cal round fast enough to disable your gunner. Now, going into the IS-2, and this is where we start seeing why the IS-2 specifically is a bit of a problem for the M109G, and as the M109G frequently also has to fight the Americans, this does compound and make this one of the more difficult of the M109s in order to operate. The IS-2, obviously, if you hit the front of the turret face, because the turret is so far forward on the vehicle and there isn't a really thin driver's hatch, what generally happens is your shell does basically nothing. You might knock out a machine gun and that's about it. For this reason, on the IS-2, while there are parts like the turret ring that you could conceivably hit from the front and this will knock them out, what's often advisable is to go for the cupola. And this isn't necessarily because the cupola itself is that thin. What's actually happening is you hit the cupola and then the shell looks down and sees the much thinner turret roof and goes straight through it. This is another misconception, is that with high explosive rounds like this, oftentimes if you're shooting the cupola, it's less because the round can pen the cupola and more because the round can usually pen the turret roof even if it can't pen the cupola. This is also why a hit to the cupola might not result in a kill if the cupola is far enough off to the side and the round hits it in such a way that it can't see the turret roof. On top of that, much like the American vehicle, the Soviet IS-2 does in fact have a heavy machine gun that can very easily take out your gunner. So the IS-2 demands a relatively precise shot and also punishes you very quickly if you aren't able to land it. This is also carried forward if you take the M109G into higher battle ratings where you will fight things like the IS-3. Ultimately though, no matter what enemy you're fighting, you simply have to remember the trick of the shell is looking for the weakest piece of armor in a radius that it can potentially penetrate. So this is part of the reason why I advise with a lot of these artillery pieces to aim as high as possible. There's almost no thing as hitting too high on the vehicle because that increases the likelihood that it can see a thin enough plate that it can penetrate. And unlike hits to the back or engine or underside of the vehicle where you could potentially get caught on an engine or transmission, if you detonate above the vehicle, there's basically nothing between your shrapnel and the crew. And that wraps up our video. I hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something. If you did, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.